Historians often refer to a time period of significant changes as a revolutionary time period. Think of the Neolithic Revolution, where we shifted from hunting and gathering to farming and ranching. And we've talked about the American Revolution, where we shifted from monarchy to democracy, or the French Revolution, where we shifted from monarchy to democracy to monarchy again. Today we're going to talk about a different kind. We're going to talk about the shift from farming to factory work. This is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was a significant change in the economy of the world. People were abandoning the old cottage system, where they had worked piecemeal and been paid by the piece they produced from home. And instead, were going to a factory system, where they went to a place where the supplies were, and they produced a product for wages, often 12 to 14 hours a day. And while England is almost always considered the first nation to really industrialize, the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century actually finds its roots in France. This shouldn't surprise us too much. Think about the advantage that France had after the French Revolution. They had the Napoleonic Code in place, which was a law that governed everything all the way across the continent, from border to border in the French Empire. They also had French communal law. And French communal law allowed the entering and leaving of contracts openly. It allowed open markets. It also had uniform regulations for how trade could be done. France had a standard weight and measure system, which meant that if you bought a pound of something anywhere in the French Empire, you knew how much it really was. Other places hadn't always established that. Probably the most important thing France had, though, was they had the most advanced national bank in the world. The Bank of France was there to finance a lot of this. And this ended up being the European model for a reliable currency later on. While France had natural advantages early on, they had some significant disadvantages too that kept France from being the country that picked up the ball and really ran with it during the Industrial Revolution. The disadvantages included all the years of war France had had. They had fought on the American side in the American Revolution. They had then fought the French Revolution. Then they fought the Napoleonic Wars. They were basically at war from 1776 until 1812. So this had sapped the energy from the government. And when the Napoleonic Wars ended and the soldiers came home, there was high unemployment because these men knew how to fight and kill on the battlefield. They didn't know how to act as members of society. And French businessmen were often afraid to take risks, a fear that the English didn't seem to have. England is where the Industrial Revolution really takes off. And it had some kind of strange background to it. You may have heard of something called the Enclosure Movement. England had a tradition dating back hundreds of years of having common land. And common land was land that was owned by the public, by the government. Yes, it was the king's land, but it was considered to be land that was free for people to use. So you had people that didn't own land that could still be farmers or sheep herders or cattle ranchers, and they could do that on the commons, on the public land. But between 1700 and 1850, there was a series of 6 different enclosure movements where slowly England closed off some of this common land, a little bit at a time, to the use of the public, and it became just the king's land. In 1700, there was less than 1% of the common land that was enclosed. By 1850, it's over 50% of all the common land is enclosed, shut off from the public. How's that going to lead to the Industrial Revolution? Well, these people that didn't know how to do anything else, they were farmers, but they didn't own land. They had to find some way to make a living because the public lands weren't available to them anymore. So what do? They go to work in the factories. In the early days of the Industrial Revolution, wood and water is what powered it. Water wheels are what drove to get the energy to drive your factories, and wood is what your machines were made of. But between 1840 and 1880, there's going to be a big change in that. Suddenly we discover that more powerful than water, coal. More powerful than wood, iron. And it turns out that England has a great deal of coal and iron on the islands. And suddenly the use of this coal and iron became more practical. We developed some systems that made steel an ambitious but still practical way to build products. The first was called puddling in 1820, which was a method of making pig iron, which is basically raw iron. Pig iron is not super strong, but it's much stronger than wood. In 1829, they find a way called hot blasting, and hot blasting allows you to make iron that is cheaper and purer into steel. And finally, in 1856, we came up with the Bessemer process, which, while developed in the United States, is going to be adopted by England very quickly. And the Bessemer process is going to be a way of super oxygenating the steel or the iron to make a steel that is not only stronger than any steel in the world, but more affordable to make. Suddenly, all the parts of the Industrial Revolution are there. Coal mining is a dirty job. It's a job that a lot of people didn't want to do. So who ends up doing it? Well, mostly the poorest in society and children. Lots of children. The advantages to using children in a coal mine is that you don't have to make the tunnels as large. And kids were kind of seen as more expendable in this time period. And when you see the amount of coal that they had to mine out of the ground, you understand why they needed every possible body to do this. In 1800 in Britain, they had mined 1 ton of coal and used 50,000 miners. 1 ton and 50,000 miners. By 1914, they are annually mining 250 million tons and using 1.2 million miners. One of those men that we should all know, and many don't, is a man named Richard Arkwright. Arkwright developed the power loom, the Arkwright loom. It revolutionized the textile industry. Suddenly, factories could produce large amounts of textiles, large amounts of fabrics, something that used to be done by hand in the cottage system. The secret was so well guarded that if you knew how the arkwright machine was built, you weren't allowed to leave England. In fact, it's going to be taken to the United States by a spy who goes and works for Arkwright for over a period of years and slowly copies down his plans and takes it to the U.S. Industrial espionage in the 1800s. How effective was this? The lowlands of England become the center of the textile industry for the entire world. In 1813, there were about 2,400 looms and 150,000 workers in Britain. By 1850, that number explodes to 224,000 looms and over 1 million workers. And they're producing the majority of the textiles for the entire world. One of the downsides of an industrial revolution is regimentation. People who had grown up on farms were used to working very hard. My grandfather used to say they worked from can to can't. Well, when they go to work in factories, they're still working hard, but they're working on a very rigid schedule. A schedule that's usually 12 to 14-hour days. 12 to 14 hours in dangerous conditions with mind-numbing monotony. If you could imagine, your job in a factory is you put this bobbin on the loom over and over again all day long for 14 hours. It's not a life that people enjoyed. The next big invention of the Industrial Revolution was James Watt's steam engine. It was a way of using steam from boiling water to drive a product. And while the steam engine was originally developed for use in factories, it was soon adopted by everything. Railroads, boats, tractors. Everything was being driven by steam. During the Industrial Revolution, while many people got very wealthy, others continued to stagnate in the pores of society. Let's talk about some of the results of the Industrial Revolution that we don't think are so positive. London becomes known for its air pollution. The burning of the coal to power all of the steam engines was putting vast amounts of black smoke into the air, and people were getting sick from it. The city even got a thin coating of coal dust across it, and London became famous for the sootiness of it. People continued to live in these ethnic ghettos all the way through London. The poor lived in Poorside. It was not a good time to be there, and the government didn't have any kind of a welfare program. Instead, what we had were charities that did soup kitchens and poorhouses and work homes. There was no parachute for you. There was no government program to save you if you were unemployed. There was no minimum wage. If you were an industrial worker, you were essentially slave labor. One of the groups that was very much against industrialization were the Luddites. You may have heard that term before. I'll sometimes joke around and say that I'm a Luddite. The Luddites were a group that were really big, basically 1810 to 1816, right in that area. And they take their name from a mythical man named Ned Ludd, who was supposed to live in Sherwood Forest, and he was a Robin Hood kind of character that was very much against technology. And the Luddites, they were afraid of technology, particularly power looms, because they looked around and they said, these are taking jobs from us. People that had always worked in the cottage system, we can't compete with these factories. So these Luddites would go in and attack what they called the water frames or the power looms, and they would literally attack the buildings and with whatever implements of destruction they could find, destroy the looms. They were trying to hold back technology. The result of this is today, to be a Luddite is somebody that's afraid of technology, kind of like me sometimes. The rise up against the government and the economy is going to force the government to respond in some ways. In 1832, they're going to abolish slavery throughout all of the British Empire. Heroic thing. I think we're all glad they abolished slavery. England is often given credit for abolishing slavery as a moral principle. I would argue that they were actually abolishing it as more of a moral principle, an economic principle than a moral principle. They were doing it because slave labor was competing with wage labor, and they were trying to raise the prices of wage labor in England. The Sadler Commission came in to look into working conditions, and they investigated a lot of problems and came up passing what we call the Factory Act in 1833. And the Factory Act actually reduced the amount of dangerous child labor. It didn't stop child labor. It just said that there were certain jobs that kids would not be allowed to do. They also in 1832 pushed through what we call the Reform Bill. And what the Reform Bill did is it broadened the voting base for the cities. That was in 1832. It still doesn't give everyone the vote. In fact, a majority of Englishmen didn't have the right to vote. But it broadened it and it brought more people into the franchise. So suddenly more people had a say in their government. This was all in a response to the anti-industrialization protests, particularly of the Luddites.